I don't think it's inherently a bad thing to have expectations, to have hopes of one of the most genre and truthfully milestone-defining video games of all time, to make some type of glorious return to the industry, to innovate to be a technical marvel, and hopefully put the science fiction and horror genre back to the forefront of everyone's minds, and to redefine what a horror game is, to be able to use sound and visuals in a way like no other. In an industry that grows and evolves a mile a minute, being able to use things like no other would be an incredible achievement that'll really, and I mean really, set it apart. 2008 with the original Dead Space, I'd say it was different. Audiences weren't used to photorealism or incredible audio, especially not used the way this game used it. Implementation and presentation was on its side. Both delivered and managed to give an experience like no other. An experience that set the standard for one of the most beloved horror series of all time. An experience that to this day, over 15 years later, is one of the best games of all time, and no game since then has been able to even come slightly close to rivaling it. So when we heard that Callisto Protocol was going to be a spiritual successor, a Dead Space that didn't carry the original IP but was still the Dead Space we knew and loved, a sentiment that was even further backed up by the news Glenn Schofield, the creator-director of Dead Space, was behind this new game, it seemed like a dream come true. I also want to say that the interview he did a few years back discussing stories behind Dead Space and how he has more ideas and would love to create another one, this looked really like a godsend, especially since this didn't have the bad taste of EA's shitty name and reputation all over it. How could this game not fail? A new unknown development team with the creative mind behind the most iconic horror games of all time. The possibilities truly were endless. Maybe it's due to the monumental love and success that the name Dead Space carries. They could have played a role in this game's still mixed reviews on Steam. Maybe the game is as mediocre as some claim, or maybe it was a marketing mistake that just doomed this game from the start, by this game promising something it ultimately wasn't. By setting that image in people's heads of this potentially being Dead Space 4 or Dead Space-like experience and not receiving that, it's not just a disappointment but a slap in the face, and you can feel it in these Steam reviews. Whether it was due to the unbelievably high expectations, the accompanying disappointment, or truly the merits of the game itself, what we can't deny is this game falls to nearly every horrible modern gaming trend it could have, starting with tying itself to an insanely loved and successful IP. Then, whether it feels true or not, the news of animations and deaths being locked behind a paywall, literal extra content that's already done and ready to go is kept from those who already dropped, in some cases depending on the platform, $70 plus for this game. Up to 25 or potentially even more death animations being tied to DLC. I mean, is that really worth tying it to? Why keep that out of people's hands if it's done? Why are things like simple death animations expected to be locked behind a few extra dollars? I obviously can't speak for everyone here, but for me personally, I brushed it off when I first heard the news. I mean, sure, I'd scoffed at it, and it was pretty funny to me to be able to say a former EA employee is carrying the company's legacy of nickel and diming its audience on. But jokes aside, I was a little curious, not only if it was true, but how would it really be done? Because if we're talking strictly animations here, I don't think I've ever heard of that being done before, so props for the innovation. But what else can they really do with a game like this moving forward? What else can we really see being tied to a few extra bucks? I was willing to see that. I already pre-ordered the deluxe edition, so what do I really have to worry about? But the backlash had to have started some type of insane amount of negative press, as Glenn Schofield had to come out and clarify what the situation really was. Whether if this was damage control or the bare truth, the bottom line is the damage was already done. Before the game is even released to the public, people's guards are going to naturally be up now. I wonder what type of animations were taken out. I wonder what else they removed from this game. I wonder what this game was meant to be like before the thought of extra money came to fruition. These are just symptoms of the ailment behind hearing things are tied behind a paywall, and not too many can easily forgive or forget that.
You shouldn't worry so much, you know? Live longer.
The beginning of this game's bad reputation was already starting, but it's nothing to this game's next insanely massive fail, and that's the game's launch. Bad launches, huge day one patches are a trend that will never go away, at least not anytime soon. It's gotten to a point where if a game launches and there's no day one patch, it just feels like we're in store for an unplayable experience. We're missing something. What's going on? Did the devs forget? Are our systems going to be bricked up? Is this game going to be treated like it wasn't meant to be released, and is it just going to keep crashing because while the clock did strike midnight, the day one patch isn't out, and therefore the game is going to be treated like we got around that timer and it's going to keep crashing? It just feels like everything is off and we ultimately can't do anything about it. That's just the way it works now. Day one patches, and even when receiving that, sometimes there's still crashes, stutters, audio problems, saving problems, inventory bugs. The list of what games can have and experience in the days following a launch can be infinite, and sometimes it's the weirdest shit you would ever hear of and makes absolutely no sense. Callisto Protocol is not unique here. I just want to make that clear. The problem is because this game wasn't even playable. I'm sure the topic has already been beaten to death, so I'm not going to harp on it myself for too long, but no game should release in this state. It shouldn't be to the point where people with insanely high-end PCs can't even play on low to medium settings with an unstable 20 to 30 frame rate. I personally struggled myself. I have a very high-end PC, just bare specs, 32 gigs of RAM, 3080 with the Ryzen 9 5900X, and I've never gotten sick trying to play a game before. This one, however, after 2.5 hours, I just couldn't do anymore. I had no choice. I said, fuck it. I ultimately gotta wait till some type of patch or update comes out because I'm actually getting sick. It was later stated by Glenn Schofield that this game's horrible performance was due to a quote-unquote clerical error and the wrong file got uploaded. Again, that's all fine and dandy, but people will not forget this. They didn't forget the locked death animations, and now your game experienced one of the worst launches to date. It was so bad that it affected everything. Cutscenes, basic movement, the combat. In my personal experience with the stutter and frame rate drops, it was of course, well, I couldn't even say worse in the bigger areas because it was so unpredictable. But what I did notice where it was consistently worse was when the enemies popped up and I had to actually dodge their attacks. It felt like an unfair fight at every turn because ultimately they're already connecting before I can even see or the game acknowledges my input, resulting in death after death. I'd say thank God, as the animations were so satisfyingly bloody, it didn't matter as I enjoyed watching what happened to Jacob at every turn. But then the thought of how many death animations were pulled came up again. I'm kidding, that's a very bad joke, but the frame rate did sour the taste of Jacob's glory end. I'd be lying if I said after the many patches this game was still running like shit, because thankfully it's not. The frame rate and experience overall is much better. The game did crash for me a few times post-patch, and weirdly, there are a lot of times where the quality would just go to utter shit. I'm not too sure if this was just a part of the game that my PC struggled to render, or if it was just a bug, or what the fuck was going on, but it's still worth mentioning, because it was odd and I've never had this happen in any game before. But now that the initial bad press and horrible launch is addressed, how is this game's combat and story? Listen, if this game was released a few years ago, I think it'd be praised by everyone. Visually stunning, I don't think anyone can argue that it's gotta be one of the most beautiful games, especially in recent memory. Audio's top-notch, lighting is great, facial animations, presentation on the visual and sound front is nothing short of spectacular. But the combat is incredibly boring. It's uninspired and unbelievably repetitive. Let's talk dodging, for example. In the middle of a skirmish, you press left or right. On PC, basically hit A or D to dodge. There is no window to it, you just hit the button and Jacob would dodge the swing. You have a block button, but truth be told, I didn't use it once during my entire playthrough because guess what? Every enemy encounter, including the boss fights themselves, are the exact same. Dodge a few times, they open themselves up to an attack, you take the opportunity, then you dodge again and repeat it. It's funny that I hear people talk about how there is no big enemy variety, which is true and honestly wouldn't matter as much if the few enemy variations we did have actually involved you to change up how you dealt with each one, which it doesn't. The dodge mechanic itself is weird, as again, there's no dodging window, so it's not hard to dodge anything, and I actually even heard that you can even make this completely automatic by going into the game's accessibility settings. Whether if that is true or not, there's no real challenge or difficulty tied to the enemies. Learn the patterns of one and you learn the patterns of all. The only time anyone or anything really imposes any type of challenge is when you have to deal with multiple enemies at once, and then guess what? You'll learn these encounters are also dealt the same way. You survey the environment, try to find explosive canisters, or if those are unavailable, maybe there's some wall-mounted spikes, some giant-ass fans, or some cliff you can throw them into or off of. You can't really fight multiple enemies head-on as that is certain death. The way the dodging works, while it is face-spittingly simplistic, it's not designed to deal with any more than one enemy at a time. And if you manage to get attacked from behind or multiple angles, you're fucked. As not only can the game's dodging system not handle multiple enemies or multiple hits in rapid succession, Jacob's so slow you can't reposition yourself. Everything outruns you. The checkpoint system also doesn't help much, as when you die, let's say you invested into a handful of upgrades in the last room you were in that had a UJC buy station or upgrade station, those upgrades won't be saved. And sure, you can argue it's nothing more than a minor inconvenience. It would still be nice in, say, a room like this where there are multiple enemies. If I was to die, I didn't have to look forward to repeatedly making sure what I just invested into a minute ago was done again. Well, I'm talking about the UJC buy station. Let's discuss weapons and how you upgrade them.
This'll come in handy though. Take that over to the Reforge. You can use it to print a new weapon.
Throughout your journey in Black Iron Prison, you'll come across basic weapons that are integral to the gameplay loop. The baton, shotgun, hand cannon, and lazily titled grip are all but guaranteed. As you progress through the story, these will naturally be given to you. As you explore, however, you can unlock a few other weapons like an assault rifle, tactical pistol, and skunk pistol, which is essentially a pistol that fires shotgun rounds. Useful, as every weapon type has its own ammo type, but you get these by first exploring, finding that particular weapon schematic in the environment, acquiring enough Callisto credits, which is this game's version of in-game currency to use at the UJC station, and the credits themselves can be found anywhere from inside crates on enemies or just laying around on, say, a counter. But each weapon, from the baton and grip to the shotgun and assault rifle, have their own upgrade trees that expands the most basic of improvements, like stability, increased ammo carrying capacity, and then eventually for some reason it randomly jumps to being able to buy homing rounds or explosive rounds, of course at an insane amount of Callisto credits, but depending on the weapon will determine which of these two you can unlock. Either way, the jump in credits and what these weapons do seem to be randomly extreme. The weapons themselves personally feel a bit generic as well, and I can't tell why the decision to jump to this was made. It makes the game feel like it's unsure if it wants to be the horror game we expected with the good amount of tension placed on us due to the extra scarcity of ammo, or if the devs wanted us to slowly turn this horror game into an action game. If they wanted to, it would have made much more sense if they kept, let's say, the homing and explosive rounds, but tied it to either a New Game Plus or they did what The Last of Us Part 1 did. After beating the game, you can use credits from completing challenges or milestones in the story to unlock this type of stuff, and that would be accessed through a separate menu that you pretty much have to go out of your way to activate. That would have given an extra incentive to beat the story and new ways to play the game without this feeling of it being so out of touch with everything else this game is trying to accomplish. To go from this intense feeling of fear to, oh look, I can have explosive pistol rounds, it just doesn't feel right. Speaking of which, let's jump on the story now. An interesting premise for sure, which if you don't want the story to be spoiled for you, I'd suggest clicking away now or fast forwarding to the end, as I'm going to be talking about this game's main story, a twist that was presented to us, you know, if you even want to call it that, and the ending. So final chances, I will be doing just that, because the ending of this game seems to be something that quite a few people are having issues with, including myself. So this is your final chance to do so, as I'll be talking about this game in length.
An alien life form, released by the miners when they broke through to Callisto's subsurface ocean. It was dead by the time we arrived.
But the game takes place in the year 2023. You play as a freelance contract freight supporter who's making shipments of unlabeled yet highly volatile cargo from the UJC-operated Black Iron Prison on Callisto to Europa. Jacob has been doing this for the last few months, and this job in particular is meant to be his and his partner Max's last ones ever, with the job supposedly being so lucrative they'll never have to work again, with retirement looming on the horizon. The job quickly goes south, however, as upon re-entry into Callisto's orbit, some members from the Outer Way, which is a group seen as those responsible for the recent massive biological attacks on Europa, board Jacob and Max's ship. They end up crash landing back onto Callisto, where Max dies upon impact, with this image haunting Jacob for the rest of the game, but he and Danny, the leader of the Outer Way group that boarded his ship, are caught and arrested by Captain Leon Ferris, with Jacob in particular having no charges presented to him and ultimately being arrested at the behest of Black Iron's warden. Jacob is quickly fitted with a core device planted in the back of his neck, a device that has both story and gameplay purposes, as it's an indicator for the level Jacob's health is at, while it can also be used as a means to load and transfer data between people, allowing them to literally experience each other's memories. After the grueling booking process, Jacob wakes up in the middle of his cell, with the prison on high alert. It looks like Black Iron is being overrun, which you quickly find out is due to these biophages, which are basically inmates inflicted with some type of unknown disease. After escaping his cell, Jacob meets with Elias Porter, a fellow inmate who sees this as a golden opportunity to escape. He helps you navigate the prison, as he's been here for so long he knows it like the back of his hand. It's also important to point out that most of the time here, Jacob and Elias are ultimately communicating via radio, and it's a really short time we get to see or spend with him. This is important, as I'll bring this back up later. But Elias eventually mentions that there's a talented hacker that was placed in the prison's special housing unit, and without their help, they ultimately won't be able to escape. Jacob obliges, only to find out this talented hacker Elias spoke of is Danny, the Outer Way leader responsible for his ship crashing and ultimately the reason why he's in prison. Danny likewise doesn't trust Jacob, locks him in her previous cell, and leaves.
Well, look, I've been here forever. Right, I've got all the information on this place, and I can get us to the hangar. All right, now you can call down a shuttle, and he can fly it out. Look, we can do this. We just got to stick together, all right?
Thanks. I'll take my chances. A word of advice, though? Don't trust him. He's It's not what he seems.
Despite this giant setback, since not only are Jacob and Elias separated, but a bit of trust was betrayed, Jacob and Elias continue on their way to the hangar in hopes to get hold of a ship and finally escape the prison and the madness that's unfolding. With Jacob and Elias now separated, the game takes you through the prison's habitat, where you're able to see how some guards dealt with the outbreak, different enemy types, and in some spots the developers excellently implemented the use of fog. And honestly, if it wasn't for the dumbass jump scare sound effect every time enemies pop up, a lot of these areas would provide a much more terrifying experience, because hearing that sound every other minute to 5 seconds in a 10-hour experience gets old incredibly quickly. After finally meeting up with Elias yet again, honestly I feel like this is a moment that was meant for us to be able to be more relatable to Elias, as this seems like it was meant to be a huge reveal. It was just another shoulder shrug moment. As expected, with Elias and Jacob not really knowing much about each other, Jacob finally gets to know why Elias has been locked up. He's been arrested and convicted of murder. It was just a shrug, oh wow, I didn't see that coming moment. It seemed like a little bit of a cliche, honestly. I mean, what's the worst thing any of us can really think of when finding someone in prison that tends to have some type of helping hand towards us? Usually the worst thing is they're a convicted murderer and have some ulterior motive. After all, if they're willing to take the life of another human being, what else are they willing to really do? All the cards are on the table at that point. And surprise, Elias is convicted of just that. But guess what? You can't even let that sink in for a moment, because a few seconds later, Captain Ferris, who earlier in the game was attacked by a handful of infected inmates, pops up out of nowhere, clearly infected himself, and opens up a door exposing Elias and Jacob to Callisto's surface. I'm gonna just go ahead and let the clip naturally play for you, so that way you see exactly what it is I'm talking about here.
I never asked you. What are you in for?
What? You worried you're helping a murderer escape?
Well, yeah, kinda.
Well, you are, man. So what? Look, it's a long time ago, yeah? I was defending myself. Wrong place, wrong time. Made a lot of bad decisions back then.
Yeah, well, you were probably just dealt the shitty hand.
No. I was used to blame everyone else. But then I realized this was on me. Can't keep running from what you've done.
Couldn't say it better myself. There's always a price to pay.
There's no time for us to feel any type of emotion or connection to Elias, or let that seemingly big reveal sink in. The reveal was stumped, and it was stumped even further because guess what? This man dies a few moments later as his face mask breaks and he suffocates to death. What the hell, man? This is the person, with the exception of Danny, that we have the strongest connection with. I mean, it's not much, but the fuck? Soon after the death of Elias, Danny shows up, rips out Elias's cord to get the prison layout for herself, and to no one's surprise, she still doesn't trust Jacob and tells him to get going. But less than an hour later into the game, she seems to have a change of heart and decides to actually team up with him, initiating the next phase in the game, where the two of them start working together to escape. On the surface, it's clear Danny still doesn't trust Jacob for one reason or another. It's clear Jacob doesn't trust her, as from his perspective, she's the very reason why he's caught up in this giant mess. Following a quick detour to the wreckage of Jacob's crashed ship, where they only find medical supplies, the two make it to the hangar to summon a ship to pick them up. However, Cole, the warden of Black Iron Prison, intervenes and shoots down the ship, stating nobody's allowed to escape. The ship crashes into the hangar and causes it to collapse, forcing Jacob and Danny to flee. With their only method of escape gone, Jacob and Danny then decide that their only course of action from this point forward is to confront Cole directly and get answers from him. The two make their way through the ruins of Arcus, Callisto's original colony before it was abandoned, with Black Iron Prison later built on top of it. They discovered that Arcus suffered an outbreak similar to what's going on in Black Iron right now, and the UJC subsequently exterminated the entire colony and covered it up. They also found a lab holding a dead alien creature that the original Arcus miners accidentally unearthed. They quickly learned that the biophages are parasites that were found in this dead alien. Seeing its potential for accelerating evolution, the UJC harvested the alien's larvae and began experimenting with it on humans, which ultimately caused the outbreak. However, there was one biophage, Subject Zero, who somehow retained his intelligence before he was ultimately killed during the sterilization. You pretty much end up finding this all out from Dr. Caitlin Mahler, the doctor of Black Iron Prison, who's responsible for not only that nice little core implant in the back of your neck, but she's also responsible for the outbreak in the prison. Sort of. She admits that the outbreak on Europa was a diluted version of the virus, which Jacob and Max were so kind to unknowingly transport there. And Cole took this opportunity to release the test subjects she's been experimenting on his behalf inside the prison in hopes to find an alpha. And that alpha, as it turns out, to be the infected Ferris. The game wraps up with a 2-stage boss fight with Ferris, who you have to extract the blood from, as his blood is the key to synthesizing an antidote for Danny, who has been infected. You defeat Ferris, runs an escape pod where in an attempt to right the wrong he realized he did, Jacob throws Danny with a sample of the larvae to expose what the UJC did. She escapes while he awaits his fate, ambushed by some infected inmates on a self-destructing prison. We expect him to die, until we're left with the cliffhanger.
Jacob, there might be a way out after all.
Reactor 4 temporary status activated.
But I'm going to need your help.
The cliffhanger is a source of more frustration, as people are claiming the game's true ending is tied to a paywall, the DLC. Whether if you want to look at it like that or not, I think it's completely up to you. Personally speaking, I felt like this cliffhanger, just like the cheap jump scares, the lack of a HUD, and using the core as the indication of your health, and even to a point the UJC buy stations, or forges as they're originally called in the game, it just felt like the Callisto Protocol tried to be its own experience while also trying to bank off the past glories that was Dead Space. From bland, incredibly simplistic gameplay, few enemy variations or ways to really approach these enemies, a story that, while is interesting and had so much potential and seemed very promising, just lacks any real connection to anyone. It's hard to say what they were really trying to achieve with this game. To recapture the old glory of Dead Space, was it to redefine a genre? Were they trying to just set up a brand new IP and see exactly what this team can deliver, since I believe it's the first game they're ever developing? I just can't say what it is. A visually beautiful work of art with an amazing sound design, the game stumbles in gameplay execution, and having an ending that would have seemed a bit more satisfying and not so much as a quote-unquote blatant placement behind a paywall, it would have probably received even more love. But I'm going to pass the question on to you. What was your experience with the Callisto Protocol? Do you think with them tying it to the likes of Dead Space, the expectations were so unbelievably high to a level the game would have never really hoped to achieve? Do you think without that connection, this game would have been able to be received in an entirely different light? Personally, I think it was a combination of multiple factors. The ending, the game's execution on both gameplay and story, the bad press of animations being tied to DLC prior to the game's release, and then of course the expectations that this is going to be Dead Space in all of its magnificent glory returning. The game had an unbelievably high bar to reach.